Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Martin Heidegger's lecture, What is Metaphysics, takes its fundamental orientation from a particular philosophical or metaphysical problem, what he calls the question of the nothing, determining what the nothing is or isn't. And you might say, well, that's not a problem at all. We already know ahead of time that there isn't anything that comes from nothing, and nothing really isn't something. And Heidegger would say, that's nice. You've managed to replicate what goes on in, Christian and post-Christian metaphysical schemes. But is that really the case? We're engaged in fundamental metaphysical inquiry. We want to approach the nothing and see what we can make of it. Now, immediately at the beginning of the essay, Heidegger is going to tell us that our existence as contemporary moderns is determined, is conditioned. It takes its orientation fundamentally from what he's terming here science or the sciences. You might say, not just the scientific method or what we reconstruct of what scientists do, but the entire panoply of, you might say, trusting in science and technology as an overarching way of understanding matters and understanding the universe. And he goes on and he tells us a few interesting things here. He talks about the sciences, the scientific fields, as being diverse. They're a multiplicity, he says. The ways they treat their objects of inquiry differ fundamentally. Why is that? Well, because they are approaching different kinds of beings, as Heidegger's going to say, different objects, the scientists themselves might say. So, for example, chemistry and biology share a lot in common, enough so that there's actually, organic chemistry and not quite fixed dividing line between that and things dealing with life, and when we can have all sorts of interesting hybrid sciences, we're blending sciences together. But, insofar as something is considered scientific, it's not necessarily because it follows some sort of, writ on large scientific method. Each different discipline has its own particular ways of doing things, understanding things, teaching things, standards. They do share some things in common, but they often have a lot that's separating them. It's also important to point out, too, that for Heidegger, science, Wissenschaft, it's a term that has a bit of a wider application in German than the term science by itself does in English. French also has something similar, and there's a distinction between, for example, the natural sciences and the human sciences. We have a lot of what we call social sciences, and you might say, well, what's different in that compared to, say, the theorization that takes place in philosophy? Sometimes the answer is not all that much. It depends on how things are being conceived. But Heidegger says that the ways in which they treat their objects of inquiry differ fundamentally, so fundamentally that, as he points out, only the fact of having universities helps to hold all these sciences together. We might think in our own time not just of universities, but also of various think tanks and research groups and corporations that are carrying out research. Those assure a kind of continuity to the notion of science. He says, only the technical organization of universities and faculties consolidates this burgeoning multiplicity of disciplines. The practical establishment of goals by each discipline provides the only meaningful source of unity. And then he points out something very important. The way he puts it is not that they aren't rooted at all in their essential ground, but that it is atrophied. The rooting in their essential ground, whatever that happens to be, in something that transcends the sciences themselves and gives them their teleology, their purpose, their orientation, that has atrophied. And so often science is being done for its own sake, or it becomes instrumentalized. Not an issue that he talks about here, but something that he talks about in many other places. Now, what is fundamental about this? Heidegger says we want to look at what's really core to science in terms of metaphysics. So he tells us in the sciences, we relate to beings themselves as they are. That's the promise of science. He also has a really interesting discussion here of exactness that I'm going to skip over a little bit. It's very similar to that in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he distinguishes between the exactness of, say, mathematics and that of other disciplines like, say, ethics, or Heidegger will have here historiographical work. Now, he says the sciences approach what is essential in all beings. This is what is viewed as being essential to science. Not the issue of exactness, but that they get at the beings themselves and what is essential to them. So he says this distinctive relation to the world in which we turn towards beings is supported and guided by a freely chosen attitude of human existence. So this is very important. There's a world. That's part of what science is examining. It turns to the world and tries to let the things themselves reveal themselves to us, oftentimes coercing them into doing so or carrying out a lot of interesting experiments on them, but by being attentive to them. And that requires, on the part of the scientist or the person who is engaging in science as an activity, a certain attitude towards those beings that will allow this to occur. So he says, here we go. It's a freely chosen attitude of human existence. Now, Heidegger says, to be sure, man's pre-scientific and extra-scientific activities are also related to beings. So the arts, culture, all of that sort of thing is also ways in which we relate ourselves to being. Science is not the only manner of approaching beings, but there's something that we moderns tend to ascribe to science. He says, science is exceptional in that, in a way peculiar to it, it gives the matter itself explicitly and solely the first and last word. So there's supposed to be an impartiality of inquiring, determining, and grounding. He says this is a submission to beings themselves. And why? In order that the beings may reveal themselves. This is where the emphasis on, say, objectivity comes in, and the reproducibility of experiments that is so key in the whole ideological apparatus of science, the story that it tells itself about itself, or rather the story that we human beings tell ourselves about our activity, science, through that activity itself, and through the institutions we build up around it. All these other things that are rolled into it. Heidegger is really putting his finger on something essential here. And he's not just setting science up to knock it down. He is saying what is actually best in the sciences at this point. So he says, going on, this position of service in research and theory evolves in such a way as to become the ground of the possibility of a proper, though limited, leadership in the whole of human existence. Science in the modern era can play a major role within our organization, within the ways in which we understand ourselves, in which the ways in which we make decisions about medicine, about city planning, about politics itself. So he goes on and he says, The special relation science sustains to the world and the attitude of man that guides it can only be grasped fully when we see and comprehend what happens in the relation of the world so attained. Human beings, or man, one being among them, pursues science. And the question then is, what is happening when we pursue science? The way that Heidegger describes this, he says, nothing less transpires than the irruption by one being called man into the whole of beings. Indeed, in such a way that in and through this irruption, beings break open and show what they are and how they are. This breaks open, helps beings above all to themselves. So this is actually, again, a very positive view of what it is that science does. What does science do? Science is one way in which we, to use another Heideggerian phrase, let beings be and allow them to show themselves to us. There's so many things that we did not know about the world that have been revealed to us through the natural sciences. There are so many things about us as beings in the world that have been revealed to us through the social sciences. And for Heidegger, that would also include history itself and some other disciplines that tell us about the kind of being that we are. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's not the problem. The problem is what got left out. So he says, this trinity, relation of the world, the attitude, and eruption, brings a luminous simplicity and aptness of Dasein to scientific existence. And here he starts getting us to the point of talking about the nothing. If we are to take explicit possession, he says, of the Dasein, the way of existing, the being that is existing, illuminated for ourselves, then we have to say three things. That to which the relation of the world refers are beings themselves and nothing besides. That from which every attitude takes its guidance are beings themselves and nothing further. That which with the scientific confrontation and the eruption occurs are beings themselves, and beyond that, nothing. Now, notice that in each of these cases, he has ended what he's saying by introducing a nothing. Is this wasted words? Is this just him closing off a sentence with a kind of parallelism that allows, maybe a flourish at the podium? No. Heidegger thinks that there is a nothing that has been ignored by science. So this is where it starts to become quite tricky. He says, what is remarkable is that the way that scientific man secures to himself what is most properly his, he speaks of something different. What should be examined are beings only, and beyond that nothing. Beings alone, and further nothing. Solely beings, and beyond that nothing. So this nothing is kind of haunting the beings that science is treating. This nothing is not being thematized by the science. So he says, well, what about this nothing? Is it an accident that we talk this way so automatically? Is it only a matter of speaking and nothing besides? Notice that he's already doing the same thing, bringing in the nothing again at this point. And he says, well, what trouble do we take concerning this nothing? The nothing is rejected by science, given up as a nullity. It's sort of stripped off. We don't have to worry about that. Heidegger wants to look at the nothing. And this is an interesting point. This is where, quite often philosophy is going to differ from the sciences by asking the questions that the scientists are not interested in asking, and will tell you, we don't ask that sort of thing here. Get the hell out of here. Go down to the philosophy department. Which is how some people get their starts in philosophy. Now, how could we elaborate this question, as Heidegger says? Here is where we have to turn to the question of logic. Heidegger is not going to go as far into this as he does in some other works, but he is going to tell us that, so the sciences are supposed to be ultimately resting on some conception of logic as something like the normative laws of thought that govern everything, inescapable. Somehow they are not only governing our thought, but also being itself, and that is something we can't get away from. And logic is not going to allow us to grapple with the nothing in the way that Heidegger really wants to. It is going to have an answer about the nothing, but in a sense it's the wrong answer. So Heidegger goes on and he says, what is the nothing? Our first approach to this question has something unusual about it. In our asking, we posit the nothing in advance as something that is such and such. We posit it as a being. And he says, we can't do that. That's not going to work. That is exactly what it's distinguished from. So if we take that sort of approach, we won't attain anything. And then he says, it's not science's rejection that first of all teaches us this. The commonly cited ground rule of all thinking, the proposition that contradiction is to be avoided, universal logic itself, lays low the question of the nothing if we're trying to frame the nothing as something. So he says thinking, which is always essentially thinking about something, must act in a way contrary to its own essence when it thinks of the nothing. It has to stretch itself in such a way as to do what it is not what its job is. And so he says, have we arrived at the end of our inquiry? Assuming that in this question, logic is of supreme importance, that the intellect is the means and thought the way to conceive the nothing originally and decide about its possible exposure. So here, why is he talking about logic at this point and the intellect? One way of approaching the nothing is precisely to try to go deeper, to go into the very foundation of things. And we often think that we do so by getting to logic and by using the intellect and by thought thinking about itself. When we do that, we arrive at a formulation of the nothing that Heidegger says is a mistaken one. Namely, that nothing is the negation of the totality of beings. Now, what does that mean? That means think about everything, and now think about not that. Think as many things as you like. Now think about the negation of those. Negate each one. Let's take a very concrete example. Think about me, Dr. Sadler, in front of you. Now take away my voice. Maybe you do this by turning off the sound. Do that the second time around, right? And now imagine my glasses gone, and my hair gone, and my tie gone, and my shirt gone, and everything else about me gone as well. You are negating me. Don't just remove all the clothes, because then you just got a naked me standing here, and that's still a me. Negate the whole thing, the whole package. And negate the chalkboard. Negate everything that you're seeing through there. And now you've got an idea about what Heidegger is talking about. Negate the totality of beings, and you're left with nothing. What this means is that nothing would be essentially dependent upon this operation of negation carried out by the intellect. Heidegger wants to suggest to us that the relationship between nothing and negation is actually the opposite. That negation derives fundamentally from the nothing, and that logic and the intellect is not our primary mode of access to the nothing that is, or isn't, the nothing that nothings, to use that phrase that caught the attention and ire of the logical positivists. That is the approach that he's going to take. And so what does this mean? That the sciences, as great as they are, have left something out that they themselves cannot take account of. Metaphysics is going to be required in order to get us there.